In our last lecture series, we talked about American imperialism and how American imperialism evolved. First of all, as a consequence of population and economic growth. Second, because of economic competition with Europe spurring the United States to look for new markets. And finally, a cultural movement known as social Darwinism, leading many Americans to believe that as a white Anglo-Saxon and Protestant nation, the United States should lead countries that weren't so. In this lecture, we're going to look at how the United States specifically applied these principles to colonize and claim new territory both in the Pacific and in the Caribbean Sea. Places like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. To begin, we'll discuss Hawaii. The United States and Hawaii enjoyed a long and mutual relationship during the 19th century. Americans gradually came to regard the Hawaiian Islands as an extension of the Pacific coast. American ships depended on Hawaii as a coal refueling station. But in 1890, a series of protective tariffs, beginning with McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, raised barriers against Hawaiian sugar. American sugar plantation owners in Hawaii sought to annex the islands. However, standing in their way was the monarchy of Hawaii, led by Queen Liliuokalani, a nationalist who insisted that Hawaii's future and its economy should be controlled by Native Hawaiians and not white Americans. Plantation owners, mostly American, were alarmed by the Queen's policies when she retaliated against the McKinley Tariff Act by placing her own set of protective tariffs on American imports. This tiny minority of white plantation owners, led by American Stanford B. Dole, yes, the Dole Fruit Packing Company is named after him, organized successfully to revolt in 1893. They were openly assisted by the U.S. military, who landed under unauthorized orders by the Minister of Honolulu, John C. Stevens. Stevens arranged a forced treaty with Queen Liliuokalani and sent it off to Washington, D.C. However, before the treaty could be passed by the U.S. Senate, incoming President Grover Cleveland assumed office and indicated that he would refuse to sign any annexation without investigating the matter himself. He sent a special envoy to Hawaii to find out whether or not this was a suitable match. And what he discovered was, and this should be no surprise, that most Hawaiians did not favor annexation. Furthermore, the provisional government that had been established by the plantation owners had taken power by force, and that the U.S. Army had been complicit in this. Cleveland ordered troops to be removed from Hawaii, and the island was left in a state of tentative chaos. Cleveland attempted to reinstate Liliuokalani, but failed, and revolutionaries proclaimed Hawaii as an independent republic on July 4th, 1894, naming Dole as its president. Clearly, the date was not a coincidence and had been chosen because the intention was never for Hawaii to be independent in the first place. Eventually, in 1898, President William McKinley would annex Hawaii, and Dole would become, once again, the territorial governor from 1900 to 1903. Now, one of the major concerns here about Hawaii is that it opened the debate over America's role in the world. It's the first debate over imperialism amongst the American people, but it certainly wasn't the last. Also in 1890, President Grover Cleveland would need to address the issues surrounding imperialist interest in the island of Cuba. If you recall, Cuba had been the focus of imperialist expansion in America prior to the Civil War. Southerners thought Cuba's climate, as well as its location, would make it a perfect outlet for the expansion of American plantation interests. Indeed, sugar development by American plantation owners on Cuba had taken place, regardless of the fact that it was not an American territory. In the 1890s, Spanish misrule, as well as the consequences, once again, of those nativist tariffs, led plantation owners in America to demand the government intervene in Cuban affairs. A rebellion in 1890 resulted in American property losses as well as a sense of civil unrest. The Spanish responded to the unrest in Cuba with a military dictatorship led by Valeriano Weyler, who was portrayed in the American press as a butcher. General Weyler put American and Cuban rebels into prison camps known as reconcentration camps. And if that sounds familiar to the concentration camps of World War II, they weren't much more pleasant. Spanish military concentration camps led to the death of about 100,000 people between 1896 and 1898. The American press latched on to the stories of these atrocities and published them freely in the Hearst and Pulitzer publications. Yellow journalism portrayed both real and imagined atrocities. For example, in 1897, there was a report that Spanish customs officials would brutally disrobe and search American women. In reality, these women were searched, but gently and by female attendants, not male military officers. William Randolph Hearst, America's premier journalist, sent an artist to Cuba by the name of Frederick Remington to draw sketches of other alleged atrocities. When Remington reported the conditions were not as bad as to warrant any kind of military hostility, Hearst reportedly replied, "You furnish some pictures and I'll furnish the war." When William McKinley came into office in 1897, American public demanded a firmer response to the Spanish behavior. McKinley would have provided an ultimatum that would have led to war with Spain. However, Spain recalled General Weyler and gave some autonomy to the Cubans. But this didn't lead to a lasting peace on the island nation. The propertied class in Cuba depended upon a Spanish monarchy, and rumor that the Cuban self-government was on the horizon led to further revolts and protests. To protect American interests, should civil war take place in Cuba, President McKinley sent a U.S. battleship, the USS Maine, to the port of Havana. The purpose of the Maine was to protect Americans if danger occurred, while also giving voice to popular distaste for Spain's reconcentration policies. This was supposed to be a friendly visit. However, Hearst published in his newspaper on February 9th, 1898, a report that the Spanish deputy to the United States, Deputy Delome, had criticized in a private meeting McKinley as a corrupt and inept official, an indication that the Spanish were going to not follow through with any of their intended reforms. The U.S. public was in an uproar as a response to this characterization of their newly elected president, and Delome was forced to resign. 6 days later, the USS Maine exploded. 266 officers and men were killed. The Spanish would investigate this mysterious circumstance and report that a fire in the coal chamber, basically the engine room of the Maine, had been responsible. It wasn't uncommon for coal dust to accumulate and ignite. Americans would not settle for such a benign answer, and their version reported that this was caused by a submarine mine. Americans eagerly championed the cause of war. "Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain" became the new battle cry. In 1976, the United States Navy would reopen the investigation on the Maine's mysterious destruction. Modern forensics would find that the blast indeed was caused by a coal chamber fire, as the Spanish had indicated, and not by subterfuge. President McKinley and the U.S. economy were not so eager for war, yet the press had forced the issue. McKinley did not want war, but was savagely criticized by jingos or imperialists, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, for taking a slow and precautious response. Really, McKinley was concerned that Cuban independence was not in the long-term interest of the United States and would cost our country money and time to rehabilitate. On April 11th, 1898, President McKinley sent a war message to Congress. It would be the first and last time a president formally asked Congress to make a decision on whether the country should go to war. But the implication was that America had a moral responsibility to free the oppressed Cubans, and Congress agreed. To make sure that this did not look like an imperialist land grab, Congress also pushed through the Teller Amendment, a proclamation to the world that once the United States had overthrown Spanish misrule, it would eventually give Cuba their freedom, although it didn't answer the question of when. What better way to initiate war over the future of an island nation in the Caribbean than a naval attack in the South Pacific? While Congress debated the president's request for war, the Undersecretary of War, a devout jingoist or imperialist, Teddy Roosevelt, had contacted Commodore George Dewey of the Pacific Fleet and ordered him to attack Spain's position in the Philippines in the event of the war. In May 1898, following the passage of the declaration of war, Dewey's 6 warships sailed into Manila Harbor, destroyed all 10 of Spain's antiquated warships. 400 Spaniards were killed and wounded. 1 American died. Not by gunfire, mind you, but heat stroke. 3 months later, American troops finally arrived and captured Manila. They were supported by Filipino nationalist Emiliano Aguinaldo. To maintain control of the Philippines, the United States needed to have access to a fueling station. Under this pretense, President McKinley annexed Hawaii. The white-dominated government in Hawaii eagerly accepted the annexation offer, similarly to Texas earlier in the century, and a joint resolution of annexation was rushed through Congress and approved by McKinley. Hawaiians were granted U.S. citizenship and received full territorial status within 2 years. Well, what about Cuba? The antiquated Spanish fleet eventually landed in defense of Santiago Harbor, where they were promptly blockaded by the more powerful American fleet. Invading American armies took the high ground around the city of Santiago without serious opposition. Leading the charge was none other than former Undersecretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, and his personal private cavalry, dubbed the Rough Riders. Heavy fighting and a limited supply of horses meant that Teddy and his Rough Riders charged on foot uphill towards San Juan. They were supported by 2 African American regiments. In fact, about 25% of the invading force into Cuba was black. In actuality, the Rough Riders first took a smaller hill and experienced heavy casualties. Teddy Roosevelt wrote romantically about the first experience of killing on the battlefield. On July 1st, the Spanish fleet was completely destroyed. The USS Oregon used more firepower than Spain's 4 armored cruiser ships combined. The total casualties for the naval battle between the USS Oregon and Spain's fleet: 500 Spaniards killed, 1 American. Santiago was surrendered by Spain shortly thereafter. In total, the invasion of Cuba would cost 379 lives in battle, and another 5,000 that would die due to disease. The United States withdrew from Cuba in 1902 to honor the Teller Amendment, but forced Cuba to write the protectionist Platt Amendment into its constitution before this exit took place. The Platt Amendment requires Cuba to not impair their independence by treaty or by contracting a debt beyond their resources. It requires the U.S. government, or gives the U.S. government the right to approve all Cuban treaties. It allows the United States to intervene with troops to restore order and provide mutual protection for the common good in Cuba, should it be needed. And Cubans promise to sell or lease their needed coaling or naval stations to the United States at will. The last measure of the Platt Amendment gave a lease to the naval base at Guantanamo Bay to the United States. This naval base continues to be used by the U.S. Navy today. Most infamously, it houses terrorists. The U.S. also sought to take control of the island of Puerto Rico before the war's end. The U.S. also sought to take the island of Puerto Rico from Spain before the war's end. Most of the population of Puerto Rico regarded the United States as a liberating hero. Spain would sign an armistice on August 12, 1898. The final treaty between Spain and the United States is called the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris of 1898 reflected the final agreement between Spain and the United States. The parameters of the agreement dubbed that Cuba would be free, upholding the parameters of the Teller Amendment. The United States received the Pacific island of Guam as a naval station, which they had captured earlier in the war. The United States gained Puerto Rico, the last vestige of the Spanish-American Empire. The Filipino issue was much more complicated. The United States had technically taken the Philippines the day after Spain had sued for peace, and thus it technically was not part of the spoils of war. The Philippines were a more complex issue. The United States took Manila the day after Spain had sued for peace, and therefore it was not part of the spoils of war. President McKinley faced a dilemma. The Philippines were a valuable port of entry into Asia. They included a population of 7 million people, larger than the British Isles. Americans did not feel the United States should give this back to Spain, especially after fighting for a war to free Cuba from their tyranny. If left alone, the president was concerned the Philippines might fall into anarchy. Perhaps Germany or another totalitarian state would seize it and move the world closer to war. President McKinley reported to the American people that he got down on his knees and prayed, and ultimately came to the decision that the lesser of two evils was to take the Philippines and leave their independence as an issue for a later time. Despite the division, the U.S. Senate passed a treaty on February 6, 1899, with the unexpected support of William Jennings Bryan, annexing the Philippines. Almost immediately, cases appeared before the U.S. court systems concerning the extent to which people living in these new territories had American constitutional rights. By 1901, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling in the now famous insular cases. They found the following: some rights are fundamental and applied to all American territories. Other rights are procedural and should not be imposed upon those unfamiliar with American law. Congress must determine which procedural rights applied to unincorporated territories like the Philippines and Puerto Rico. The Constitution did not follow the flag.